Maybe we can start with a quick review of the last class. As you remember, we're in the project management portion of the class, and we're using the project management life cycle to facilitate this class. So we've also learned from our first class that a lot of the issues can be and should be addressed during at least the planning stage, i.e. even before the project gets designed and implemented. And as I was sharing with Krista earlier, my experience has shown that the more we plan and the more control we can get over this part of the process, so that when actual implementation happens, most of the contingencies can be addressed, except for about 20%, then we're good. You just expect about 20% will hit the fan. So with that as background, what we discussed was that, there are many, many names for this thing called planning, right? I mean, there's the project lifecycle name, they call it initiating, planning, etc. And then there are many, many tools and reports and requirements that donors would have that also has a variety of content and names, like feasibility study, needs assessment. Some of them might require a business plan, strategic plan. Some might want a business model, etc., etc. Just know that all these documents fall within the whole gamut of this thing called planning. And what is needed really depends on your context, the type of project you're doing, the donors you're responding to, what you want to do with it strategically after. So because of time constraints in a course like this, we drilled down on the needs assessment and what that might look like. And that's something that's very typical in the international development industry. If you submit a document called feasibility study or needs assessment, it's generally accepted that, oh yeah, you've done some kind of a planning. So that was what we talked about in our last class. And we used Ruchita's case as the case study, and came up with sort of the methodology in a big table, and also what her needs assessment might look like in terms of the content. So at the end of the class, what we did was, we looked at the questions we wanted to ask on the 3 levels of stakeholders or stakeholder levels, and then we talked about, what are some of the methods of collections and the tools of analysis, and also what are some of the challenges. And then during the last part of class, what we did was we had what is called a roundtable exercise, and it's, as I was sharing with the group, it's sort of a way to bring up innovation and design and things like that to talk about the challenges that Ruchita might face in her case. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to review what are some of the things that, any of you, particularly Ruchita, what are some of the take-backs or takeaways from last week's class? Was the exercise useful, helpful? What was missing? What can we talk about more? Let's have a couple of minutes of discussion.
So I really loved the exercise. I got so much of, I would say, novel ideas to complete my needs assessment. I can share this sheet. I don't know how readable it will be for all of you, but I can certainly type it out. And so the way I've structured this is like I've created all the challenges and categorized them, and all the possible solutions, like the 3 solutions that we discussed, and then there were a couple of things that emerged, like crowdsourcing the needs assessment and finding local champions. I would have never thought of that.
Oh, that's
yeah.
Awesome.
I had a question, like doing this kind of roundtable or round robin, I don't know what we call
facilitation exercise. Yeah.
How many people, minimum, we should have in the group, and what should be the familiarity level of the people with the project? Because once you are very familiar with the project, you can start to think in only one direction, and so those questions.
It's probably, excuse me, I've always been a late bloomer of sorts, so I caught the tail end of the, coldish flu or whatever. Well, and that goes into the methodology design, right? If you want to have a tool like that to gather information, don't worry so much about the tool itself, what the rules are. You come back to always, what do I need to find out, what do I need to ask? So in your situation, if you've got to ask yourself, well, what are you using the round robin for? If you wanted it to, say, design your actual methodology, as opposed to, say, what we did, which was, general challenges, then your design of that particular facilitation exercise would be different. Your stakeholder would probably be more research-oriented people, and it might span a lot more. The stakeholders would probably be on the more higher level side. You wouldn't ask your farmers, for example, to come up to help with the methodology. So with that, with a caveat, an exercise like that, what you would probably want to do is, well, if there are 4 segments, of course you want at least 4, but then you only have one set of solutions. So a lot of times it depends on how big the group is. Usually about 12 is a nice size for any kind of facilitation exercise. Anything bigger than that, what you can do is you can break up the groups into subgroups and then have them address either the same questions or break them down into smaller, drill down so that each group addresses smaller ideas. Yeah.
And I have one more question. Have you seen any ideas like getting into a tangible product or at least a design from these facilitation?
Facilitation exercises like this? Sure. Again, it depends on the goal of the facilitation, right? My goal was essentially just to get a sense of okay, what are the challenges, and then what are some of the solutions. I could have done it in the usual facilitation way, but I thought, this is a little bit more fun.
I'm asking, from your experience, have you seen any facilitation translate into actual tangible product?
Yeah, obviously, yeah. The actual facilitation itself is for project design. So a lot of times, project managers, especially the more what you might call process-oriented or more, people-oriented managers, they would get feedback like that. So that there are a lot of different tools to do. Like next week, what we will do is we will be doing some kind of a technology design or requirements analysis, but we will be using yet another a prototyping facilitation exercise. Yeah, so yes, the short answer is yes. Yeah. What's up?
So I know the process got a little bit squished because we ran up against the end of class, but it actually seemed like a really useful thing to have it forced to go kind of fast because, I don't know, sometimes I get in my own way at least. Instead of going with that idea that springs up, I don't second guess it until I don't want to write it.
Yeah.
So I wondered if that was kind of part of the design.
Not part of the design. However, in any kind of facilitation exercises, you want things to be fairly fast anyway. If I had my way, we would probably have had at least a couple of minutes more to drill down on some of the details. But given our time constraint, we couldn't do that. But yeah, generally for exercises like this, you want it to be kind of fairly fast because you're doing brainstorming. If you're doing analysis, for example, then that might require a little bit more time. Yeah, but most of the time, I kind of like not thinking too much, because I feel like the best ideas come up really fast. Yeah. Any other feedback on the process, etc.? Good that we couldn't drill down onto the details, but in a class like this, if you could learn at least just the methodologies, and you'll find that these kinds of frameworks, you can have it in any one point in time, whether you're doing planning or when you're coming up with your activity matrix or when you're coming up with problem analysis for your implementation or even your M&E type of work. So all you need to do is just get the big picture in mind. Yeah. Any other feedback or lessons learned? Questions on the assessment?
I have one question. Can this be done to assess the project, I would say, the progress of a project, maybe during mid-implementation stage or
Sure, you can design, like I said, the most important thing is always to ask yourself what you're trying to find out and then get the right tool, right? It's the same question we try to ask ourselves, what are the needs of the people, and then we kind of come up with the IT solution, as opposed to coming up with a potential IT solution and then trying to fit into what you're trying to find. So in a situation like, if you want to find out what's happening midterm in a project, you would want to ask yourself, what exactly are you trying to find out? Right? That kind of a round robin is good for brainstorming. It's good for what they call innovation because we're doing redesign type work. Is that what you want to do? For the project, i.e., your 4 questions might be how do you rank? How do you think the project is going right now? Make a solution and rank how it is going and what is your problem statement. Then your second part might be, what is a potential solution to the problem. Third might be, redesign it. third month you criticize it, fourth month you redesign it. So if that's what you want, then sure. But a typical M&E type thing usually is forms on whatever you need to document based on your framework, the logical framework that we will be doing today. Am I sort of answering? Does everybody get what I'm saying, more or less? Right? Because that's actually what you're monitoring. Whereas if you want to go beyond that and you say, well, I need some kind of solutions, then that's what we can do. Yeah. Okay. Fairly okay on the needs assessment?
So,
No, go ahead.
just one more question on the exercise, mentioning with doing it with different stakeholders, how might the design need to change if you're doing it with, say, the people being directly affected? Or can it just be exported as is?
You're talking about the methodologies or the round,
Like the round robin exercise or any kind of brainstorming technique.
It could be during your needs assessment, for example, right? So you can say, what is the biggest challenge that you have right now as a farmer? And then you can pass it on to say, well, what's your solution for it? And someone else will criticize it, but then of course that you have to be, and then the last one is someone redesign it. And then you've got to be a little bit careful about the context, because sometimes people don't like to be criticized, especially in like Asian cultures or some African cultures where face is really important, and then you want to make sure that you don't put government officials together with farmers, or even sometimes men and women, because there's a lot of the dynamics that might make people not be able to be honest, right? But these are all the nuances that really will come out when you get a sense of it, in practice, because you can do it one round and then you feel like, wait a minute, all these sentences don't seem right. And then you kind of try to do another round. But those are the nuances. But as far as the tool is concerned, yes, multiple tools can be used for a variety of things. But as always, remind yourself, what is your goal first? Cool? Okay, so with that in mind, and that's a good segue into our exercise for today, because what we are doing with this particular case study is that we're using a needs assessment for this lab, right? I hope you've at least skimmed, if not read, the case. Yes? No? Skim? Okay. So, one of the things, let's look at the readings first. If we were to look at the readings, tell me a little bit about what you feel about the needs assessment. I mean, did it come up looking like a needs assessment should look like? Any questions on that? Feedback?
I think it was a little bit more detailed compared to what I'm taking as a class for needs assessment, and that's geared towards the IT and enterprise, like generally software dev projects, and this was more towards the development projects, so those kind of had separate values.
Right, and that's a great observation, because the danger about having techies or having someone go in and you say, okay, I'm going to do a requirement analysis, right? Because that's the first step of any kind of IT project, is that you already have an assumption, i.e., that your issue is an information and communication one, and your solution is a technical one, a technology one. Whereas most of the time, good principles in international development says, start from scratch. Don't assume the solution first. And so you start with what the industry calls needs. Of course, in this day and time, people have been arguing about, should I call it needs, because it is very condescending, that these poor people have needs, let's call them rights. But regardless of those debates, just know that this is a better starting point, i.e., let's look at what the needs are, and then let's see what are some of the solutions. And you can see that a lot of the solutions that they propose and recommendations, at least half of them are not IT related. Christina?
I was really interested in their methodology and their techniques. So they use some of the more traditional ones like interviews and focus groups, but they also use photography and audio, which I thought was really interesting. I hadn't heard of that as a part of a needs assessment before.
Yeah, I think that is coming up a little bit more and more, simply because of how much easier it is and how much cheaper it is to get audio and video footage. And people have different thoughts about that, in the sense that some people say, well, if you have an audio or video, people don't tell you the truth as much, and then some people say, no, that doesn't really make a difference, because, you can have more footage and archives and things like that. But you'll find that, in terms of research methodologies, it ranges from a whole range, right? From really sophisticated to, something really simple. And I think a mishmash of making sure that you have quantitative, qualitative, written, and in this day and time, when multimedia is getting cheaper, maybe get a little bit of that. In fact, I've actually done an assessment, a research project before where everything is only going to be video. Where they want to find out how the project is doing. It was a midterm evaluation, and so it goes in under the whole observation technique, right? But one of those things is video. So that was the entire thing. Just go and film. Don't talk to anyone. Just be a fly on the wall, and if possible, use one of those camcorders that no one can see. So that's also a possibility. Sometimes I've had research projects where people say, like this summer I have a research project where they want to, there's a very ambitious project. They want to figure out what are the factors that contribute to sustainability of certain types of international development projects. But the methodology, they only want case studies, in-depth case studies in 4 countries. And that's a methodology that has been decided somewhere that might not be academically sound or research sound, but it might be organizationally sound. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was just
there's more and more. You see that a little bit more and more. Yeah.
I was asked to do similar kind of, I wouldn't say at that time I was aware that I was doing needs assessment. I was told to kind of draw from case studies across different industries and apply it to Citibank's corporate chain, like their processes and all. And so at that point of time, I thought I was doing process consulting.
Right.
And but it actually was, the major part was doing needs assessments.
Right, and maybe just part of the needs assessment, because that's sort of like a literature review of what's out there or an environmental scan, and then taking that to apply, right? The other parts of the needs assessment might include interviews with your clients or your customers, interview with your managers or other stakeholders, for example. Yeah. So any other feedback on that particular needs assessment? Anybody has anything to say about it being that in the middle of a project? It was started in 2007. Yes.
So I actually liked that element. I mean, obviously, it would have been better to do an appropriate needs assessment at the beginning, but I like that a group was willing and able to say, let's stop and re-examine, instead of just pushing forward, because so often, once the decision is made, okay, we're doing this solution,
right,
it just pushes forward, and if you're lucky if even at the end somebody stops to think like, wait, was that really sensible?
Exactly.
So I like that they stopped and like, we're going to do the needs assessment now.
Right, and this is reflective of, this indicates 2 things, right? One is that you can see that it's sort of, is this an evaluation of sorts that then still is some kind of a needs assessment? So you see our project life cycle, you can see that it sort of feeds back into an evaluation that then feeds back into a needs assessment that then goes into another chain. You remember, right, our project life cycle where it says you do your planning, right? And then you're initiating, and then your implementation, and then your M&E. So, at some point you assume, okay, maybe they didn't do much planning, maybe they, parts of their initiation might just have been a donor came in and said, I really want to fund you guys to set up this lab, and then you start implementing. And so you do some kind of a needs assessment, you call it a needs assessment, but it's kind of also like an M&E. Right? And then it feeds back into the next phase of planning. And this is one thing it's reflective on. The other thing is, something like this is reflective on is that, the traditional waterfall model is, okay, I'm going to do one needs assessment over 3 years, and then after that, that's the end, the one and only one. Right? Same with, in this day and time, sometimes when we do a business plan or a strategic plan, it's usually for about 3 years in every organization. So, but you see that in this day and time, there's more of an agile kind of, let's keep going back and reevaluating. Yeah, Richie?
I had the exact same point, like when I was coming to the case, I was wondering why they did not have daily status updates or anything to evaluate, because if they had followed the Scrum methodology, like no matter how ad hoc it is, they might have been able to uncover the issues beforehand.
Yeah, and they might have, because even before this needs assessment, they alluded to another different study, right, that they call a baseline study. Anybody have a guess about what that is? That's yet another tool. And that is the reality about our world, right? It is messy. Project management tries to make sense of things, honestly, but in the real world, everybody wants everything, everybody calls different things differently. What is this baseline thing that they're talking about? Anybody visited their website to begin with? Take a look, and even their Facebook page, they have some really interesting photos too, so you can get a sense of, what their project actually looks like. Where basically it's a tying this back into what we talked about. You remember when we talked about telecenters, right? And how telecenters are now becoming more innovation labs. Remember that discussion we had, right? And so this is just one of them. I mean, it's essentially a center that provides internet access of sorts, but then right now there's there's an innovation type of culture that's injected into it. And if you read the literature that is on the website, this ties back into another one. So what I'm trying to do now is to tie back in some of the concepts that we've learned. So if you look at what they try to do, they use this term called innovation. It was somewhere, but what I wanted to show you was that what they're saying is that they're innovating with the poor. You remember the Heeks article about innovating for the poor, with the poor, and by the poor? So this is sort of like the middle ground, where it's both top down and bottom up. So it's kind of interesting to just see, like, okay, this is fairly typical of that kind of infrastructure that we would be fairly used to. This is probably the opening ceremony. Of course, this is where all the photos are taken. So tell me, anything else? Any observations? I mean, what is this baseline study? And how is that different than a needs assessment?
I think, from what I could understand, baseline study was basically gap analysis based on working with the communities.
Right, and how is a gap analysis different than, say, a needs assessment, right? Or how is a gap analysis different than a pre-needs assessment? So the bottom line is, the takeaway is, these terms are just thrown around. There's really no okay, first you do A, then B, then C, and then C point 1, 2, 3. It's not really like that. Generally, what we call a baseline study pertains a lot to M&E. When we study M&E, what we're trying to do is, okay, so let's say your project is a 3-year project, okay, and this is what we would do too. Okay, this is 1 year. So let's say you have some goals, right? And then from the goals, you develop some of your indicators, right? So what's an example of, say, an indicator for this kind of lab? Forget about the needs assessment. If you were having a lab, right, and say your goal is, access to information, right? What are some of the things that you're hoping to measure? We'll do this a lot more in just a little bit during our case assessment, but what are some of those things, very quickly? How do you measure? Or what do you measure?
I have a very basic question here.
Did you say a crazy question?
No, I said I have a very basic question, and maybe I missed when you were talking about it, but why do we want to kind of evaluate, define the metrics before we start needs assessment?
And that's a great question. A lot of times, honestly, for me, I like to build in a needs assessment and my baseline at the same time, because it means I'm just going down to the field once, I'm collecting my needs assessment data, and then at the same time, I'm doing my baseline data. So, resources-wise, it's way cheaper than to do it 2 times. Okay, but to understand what is a baseline, what you do is, okay, let's say, what do I want to measure, right? Because this is what happens when you design your log file. So let's say, okay, access to information. I don't know, number of people using lab or using internet, right? Maybe you want to say, number of local language websites, right? These are some examples, right? Da, 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 da. So at year one, what you would do is you would kind of come up with a measurement for this thing to say, okay, today in 2010, this shows you what my state of mind is. In 2014, okay, the number of people using the internet in this particular district is X, right? And then the number of local language websites is, say, about Y. So you kind of come up with all these things. You measure it, you call this a baseline. And so what happens is that as you go about with your M&E, you are actually benchmarking your measurements against this baseline, so that at the end of 3 years, when you look back at the same indicators and you're measuring the same thing, you can actually compare. Does that make sense? So that's one way of doing an M&E. So we're jumping ahead right now, but that's an introduction to how messy this world is, because why on earth would they do a baseline before a needs assessment? And you're right, I mean, how would I know what my goals are, right? And what I'm going to measure if I haven't really done an assessment to figure out what are the needs I need to meet to frame my goals. Does that make sense?
I'm still very confused about this.
Don't be, because this just shows you the practitioner world is very imperfect. Right? In the best case scenario, what you want to do is you would do your planning, you would do a needs assessment, right? As you do your needs assessment, you might come up with some kind of a simple baseline to say, okay, I'm guessing that if I wanted to do access to information, here are some of the typical indicators. Since I'm already asking people questions, I'm going to build in 6 questions that would give me some kind of a baseline. And then after you raise funds, in your budget line, you would have an M&E line item, and then you would have a work plan with your M&E, right? Okay, so at least then you would know, okay, I'm being funded $200,000 for my M&E. I can actually do whatever. You come up with a bicycle to a Mercedes model of a M&E system. Clear? Yeah, wow. I thought I was the only one that was like, living in limbo with this head code. Okay, so with that in mind, anything else to ask the feedback about the needs assessment before we actually drill down on project design and proposal?
I think since we all skimmed, maybe we could just briefly
go through the facts. Okay.
So we're on the same page.
Okay, so let's talk about, tell me, where is this set? Okay, tell me. In South Africa. I've never been to South Africa, and I've never been to the east coastal one. Does anybody know what that's like? Is it rural? I mean, I actually did a Google search, and everything came out so nice. It was like all beaches, and what is the context like? The environment?
This is rural South Africa.
South Africa, it is rural?
Yeah.
Is it ethnically divided, or is it fairly homogeneous?
I think sort of ethnically divided. I think you have like certain ethnic groups in the east. I think historically that's where those certain kinds of ethnic groups have stayed.
Right.
But
In Transkei, is like in this region?
yeah, it's not like it's just like people have always stayed in those areas, so you tend to find like more or less of the same type of people.
More or less the same type of people?
Yeah.
You mean like,
ethnic group.
okay, so like black
It's
and...
mostly Gosa, actually.
Yeah.
It's mostly one ethnic group in that region.
Okay.
Sorry, I used to work in South Africa, so I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe I'm correct. But the region where they are,
Yeah.
there are a lot of mostly
No, that's what I'm saying. Like it's just one ethnic.
Okay, so it's not that divided. It's ethnically pretty homogeneous. Okay, and then I read in their project website that this area covers 40% of the population of South Africa. Is that correct? Does that seem about right? I don't know. At least that was one of the things that they mentioned in the website, that this region, you know, they targeted this region because there's a big population there. Okay, so we know it's rural, it's poor, right? What is this? So, okay, if this is the context, tell me a little bit about what is the project that, when did it start and what is it? Started in 2007, right? That was what we determined. What kind of a, what is it?
The project they're talking about, they want to bring in technology to schools.
Yep, they want to bring in technology. So what did they do to try to bring that in? Build the lab, right? So it's the lab, and what is it's SL, let's try it out, it's SLL. That's what they call it. So tell me a little bit about what this lab is like. You know, and if you look at this, it's fairly obvious that it's fairly simple, right? You're looking at something pretty rural. You know, they're doing a lot of rural connectivity. So you're looking at something that is very basic infrastructure, like it's called a living lab, right? So it probably looks like this. I'm guessing this is the opening ceremony, and maybe, you know, 10, 12 computers, something like that. So let's go into the goals of the project. What does it do? What is it aiming to do? And if we just take one aspect of it, right? They say it's access to education and knowledge.
But this also says that it's aimed towards developing and supporting local art, pretty much everything which can be supported on an internet platform.
Right, so they basically said, okay, well, let's build this lab and then let's use this to support everything.
Yeah.
Right, and so they came up with a whole bunch of stuff. In fact, this is one out of several goals. Okay, let me backtrack. Okay, let's imagine you haven't read the case. So there are a whole bunch of goals, and Richie said you're right. Basically, what they want to do, their overriding goal is we want this lab to be just supportive of anything and everything that goes on there. And we're going to build some platforms. So aside from just hardware, there's also software solutions. So from a project design angle, okay, this is a very typical way that ICT projects are launched. It starts with an IT solution, and then it tries to fulfill some needs without doing a needs assessment. Very, very typical. We can criticize it, but say, okay, it's already been going on. So they have a bunch of goals. They want access to education, they want to do governance, they want to do business, they wanted to do some kind of social connectivity or whatever. This is all in their website. What the needs assessment is doing right now is they're cutting out all the goals and they're saying, well, we are just looking at this aspect to see what we can do better. So that's what they're zooming in with regards to this particular needs assessment. Ooh, this is, I knew it looked funny for a minute. Okay, so they are zooming this as sort of the big picture goal. So what was some of those things that they examined as, you know, whatever you want to call them, sub-goals or whatever? There were 6 components, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components that they studied based on the baseline that falls under this goal. Educational research. What else?
School management.
Management, yep. Keep going.
Teacher training.
Teacher training.
There was also proposed solution part.
There's initiatives for development project, right? And then there's another one. Collaboration. Yep. Collaboration. So there's 6 aspects of this. So basically what they're saying is look, guys, when we did the baseline and we started to talk to people, these are the themes that came out. These are what the teachers are telling us, or the people in the education side is telling us they need, right? We don't know what happened to the other types of baseline. They said the other goals, the e-business or whatever. So what he's saying is, hey, when we did the baseline, these are some of the themes that came out for us. And within these themes, we don't really know what are the details, and that's why in this needs assessment, we're trying to assess what are the challenges and what are some of the recommendations we can give in general, and in particular to SLL, to develop and design a next phase of a project that can assess that can address these goals. Make sense? Lost? Okay. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to pick out the teacher training component and actually design something together. But I don't know how far we are along. Can we do that? And before this, any other questions on the facts and the projects? Christina, is this
Yeah, was that helpful for people?
Yeah, was that helpful? Right? And then if you read each of those, if you read the education research, if you read each of the components, you will see that they talked about, the current context, right? So, for example, in educational research, it's actually very interesting. They're saying, well, there are only 4 sources. When they talk about educational research, they're talking about the kids, right? In this situation, the kids, have some textbooks as one source. Another source is they ask their parents. A third source is the posters on the walls. And the last source is this SLL lab, and that's the only 4 sources they have with educational research side of things. Well, what are some of the challenges then? Well, okay, in the very first place, there are only 4. That's really little. Secondly, with the SLL lab, there's problems with access. There's not enough computers, etc., etc. Then there is recommendations, and they did this for all the 5 different, whatever you want to call them, sub goals, themes. Bear in mind in industry, all these things are. A lot of times are interchangeable. What is an overall goal, strategic objective goals, purpose, etc. Is this useful so far? Okay, so what I wanted us to do is to zoom in on the teacher's training. So maybe you can spend, just 2 minutes, because it's 1 page, to read about these 3 things. What are they talking about the current context? What are the challenges, or what are the recommendations? Or actually, even better, forget about the teacher's training. Let's do educational research, because I already summarized it for you. Right? Just read that part, right? They're saying, oh wow, these poor kids, they have, these 4 things that they can use to do educational research, and these are the challenges. Okay? So just go through them really quickly, and then there's a recommendation. So our case study is in coming up with initiating a project design based on these recommendations, and this is usually what happens in real life. So read that, and then let's go into that proper. Wow, I was hoping for a big enough class so that I could actually divide you guys into groups and I don't have to talk so much. But I get it. I remember grad school. Thank goodness. I'm glad I'm on this side of things.
Yes, at this kind of thing.
Okay, so well, take a couple of minutes because I do want you to be familiar with that. And then once you're done with that, I want you to go through to almost the end of the article where there are general recommendations. I should say the number 7, where it says propose solutions or services, right? So in a lot of ways, the needs assessment has already sort of hinted at a next phase of a project design for you. So let's look at the solutions, and particularly the overall solutions that should be embedded into each of those things, and in particular, the educational research component. Okay, and then let's start with our project design. Ready? Okay, so we're using this logical framework. Did anybody read through what the logical framework or the you know, I just assigned a few pages. It was 2 parts of a chapter. What is the what's the logical framework? This is sort of a fairly standard tool in project management, and in particular project design and M&E. Sort of like the Bible. And I would also say that people have argued this to death, they still are, as to whether or not this is a good tool. Anybody heard of that? Gentlemen?
It's just I think it's hierarchical, like where you define your needs based on the desired outcomes. So you start from the overall goal of the project, then you define like why you want to do it. Then you define like what would be like the success criteria or what the desired outcomes. Then from there, based on those like outcomes, you define what the specific activities you do.
Right. It's basically called a logical framework, right? And what it means is that it's meant to be logical. So let's do, like, if you think of a quick exercise, at the very basic of it, and this is, so the first thing I want to mention about the logical framework is that it is generally being used, particularly by the big donors, for project design, and this is how they keep you accountable. This is the type of thing that you would use. Let me pull that out. Here is my project framework. Where's my log frame? I'm trying to look for my sample log frame for that health center. Go ahead.
I have a question regarding this framework, and I mean, is it like identifying tasks and altering like a work breakdown structure, or?
Yes, and in particular, look at this table 9 thing. It gives you a very, very clear example of how to design a community health project, right? Page 64 of the primer. Okay, you can take a glance at it, but let's think of a logical thing to do. Okay, what is the purpose of life? We're just doing a case study, but using life. Let's do something simple. What's the purpose? To get a big goal, right? What's the purpose? You can call it a purpose, mission, overriding goal.
What if the purpose keeps changing?
Yeah, it could be. What do you mean? It keeps changing? You mean the goals?
Yeah.
Well, the term that it's called also changes. But yeah, let's just set something. Let's just say, okay, this day and time, what's our purpose? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just
Get through this semester.
okay, awesome. Well, I don't know if that's going to be a purpose. And that's the interesting thing about defining a goal. Because if you look, okay, this is a log frame. It basically means A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And it just has 4 steps. So if you think of it, this is sort of like your major outcome. In the best case scenario, right, you can look at this as sort of, okay, what kind of inputs do I need to have to put in? What are some of those outputs? Okay, what are some of those outcomes? And then what is the purpose? So let's work back. Let's say, I don't know, purpose of life is happiness. Okay, let's say be happy, right? So that's your overriding happiness. This is the same as saying, okay, I want this district to, achieve absolute empowerment, right? So that's your example. What is an outcome if we work backwards? So if this is your biggest level, what are some of those things that you know, or some of those goals? These are usually higher levels. So this is your highest level goal. It goes lower, 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 right? To what are the inputs you need to put in to have an outcome, to have a purpose. So what are some of those things?
Professional and personal fulfillment.
Okay, professional fulfillment. Okay, right? Personal well-being. Right? And then what? Money? And this is interesting, right? Because then you go, is money an outcome or is money an output? Right? And this is often what we do in project design. It's like, well, where do things fit? And they don't really fit statically anywhere. It's just a way for us to make sense of what to do. So, okay, let's drill down on just one outcome, professional fulfillment. What are some of those things that would have to happen? Let's say, okay, you believe that a master's, right? That's an output that you need to give professional fulfillment. What's another thing? A job, right? A job that pays well. What other things? Recognition. What? Recognition, right? From peers, your colleagues. So you can have a variety of outputs. And so what are the inputs? What do you need to dump in to get this that would lead to this that would lead to this? Charlie, you look really confused. Does anybody, are you getting what I'm trying to do? Right? Basically, it's just a very, very, excuse me, simple framework for trying to squish something really as sophisticated as a project design into something that makes sense, so that we know what to do at any one point in time. So, again, if our overriding purpose is to be happy, one out of maybe 7 outcomes, right? Another one might be, okay, religious fulfillment, love and family, however that looks like, depending on how we frame the goals. And then, if we drill down on one of those, the outputs would be these. What would you need as an input? 2 years, right, of soulless effort. Right? That's one of the input you might need, right? Another one is, sacrifice.
Isolation.
Yeah, sacrifice of social sacrifice, right? And isolation. Right? What are the inputs do you need to put in? Maybe 21,755 assignments. Right? You might need to put in, 553 job applications.
That's a mild number.
Huh?
That's a very low number.
Right? So if you think of it this way, you're basically looking at a logical framework, right? And this is what this thing tries to do. Now, every project, so I would go back and say, the logical framework is just a framework. There are donors that uses other frameworks, and there's a lot of academic debates, if you're studying project management, that criticizes this because it says like it's too static, it's logical, but you're not letting things grow organically. Regardless, just know that happens, but know that this is still the predominant way of doing things. Now, does this make sense in a way, right? So if you look at this part of the logical framework, we are looking at we are looking at this part, right? So this is what a logical framework looks like, and if you look at that table 9, that's essentially what it does. you look at the goal, overall objective, the purpose, the outputs, the activities. If you want to put it, plunk in those things, I would say, well, a goal might correspond to your purpose will correspond to the outcome here, your outputs, or some kind of outputs and inputs might be your activities, right? And that's a way to think about how to frame it. So, with that as a backdrop, and then you talk about some of the indicators, like how do you verify those indicators? But let's not do indicators now, given all our state of mind. Let's look at this, because what we want to do using this is actually to use your needs assessment as a foundation to design your project. So to design your project, you need to figure out, well, what are the activities that I'm going to do to bring about that goal? And in addition to that, what is my work plan? When do I do what activity, right? So the first thing we need to do is design. Think about what are some of those activities, what are some of those top level type. Actually, this is not an indicator. Access, they put it here. Okay. So the overall goal, let's make it simple and say the overall goal is access to education and knowledge, right? Because this is what they were using. And then let's zoom in on the let's zoom in on the educational research component. So if I were to do an entire proposal for this, then of course I would have these 6 things under my purpose, right? I would have 6 purposes. But for now, let's zoom in at the teacher training. What are some high level purposes?
Are we doing teacher training or education?
You pick. I'm guessing education research. What do you want? You guys pick. What do you want to do? Okay. Educational resource. Let's do it. Okay. How do you frame it in a goal, in a purpose?
Increase access to educational.
Okay. We could have that like that. And bear in mind, access to oh my goodness. Sources, right? Increase access to educational resources that then logically links to increased access to education and knowledge. You get how this framework fits into that to begin with, right? So your access to education would be here. Access to education and knowledge, right? And then you would have these 6 things. So your professional fulfillment, which we're going to do right now as an analogy, is going to be your educational resources. Then these other things would be the rest of the things. Management, etc., etc., etc. Get it? So if we want to increase the educational resources, what are some of those outputs we would need? That's not, and I know this is sort of, and that's why sometimes I get irritated with log frames, because it's like, okay, what's the difference between an output and an input and an outcome? But sadly enough, a log frame like that, most of the time is plunked right into the middle of a request for proposal. So you have to just kind of insert it in. A lot of times I feel like I'm duplicating words, I'm making things up, because it's so, it's not the perfect framework, but let's stick with it because that's the general standard. So, what are some of your outputs? And essentially look at your table 9 as an example. Let's name 3 possible outputs.
Build libraries to improve.
Okay, now, but is build libraries an activity, right, or an output?
It's an input actually.
Right? It's an activity, right? So and like I said, I'm using these words very, very loosely. Okay, so in this particular situation, the input is an activity. So let's say, okay, an activity is to build library. But before we do that, what would an output look like?
More books or more number of people having access to the internet.
Yeah, it more. Huh?
Change in the perception for teachers that internet doesn't.
Sure. And then you come into, is that an indicator or is that an output, right? It gets really, really annoying. Even when I end up doing this, it's annoying. Okay, if we were to take this as an example, let's look at what they say. The purpose is improve access to and use of, what's that? Salt water? Sorry? Safe water, okay, in the community, right? So that's what they're saying is a purpose. And then what is their output? They have 3 outputs.
Improved sources of water.
Yeah, so it's still a high-level goal, right? That is not an activity. So let's frame it. Let's frame our education resource in that particular language. Just try it. Krista, did you?
Well, coming back up from the building libraries,
Yeah, the build library should, of course, be at the end, right? Because we need to figure out what is our output first. But yeah, coming up again. So what is?
I'm struggling because what I want to say is access to more books, but more books is kind of the verifiable indicator, right?
Right. So that's why I get annoyed with it, because you're really splitting hairs very, very thinly. But just do it in a way that makes sense. Let's just say access to books. Right? And maybe your viable indicator would be something along the lines of, wow, how did this get so big? Okay, access to books, and then maybe your viable indicators could be, pre and post number of books. Something like that, right?
Also the topics of books like
Okay.
verifiable indicator.
Right. So broad, increased scope of subjects. Right, and then maybe you can say, variable indicators is at least, 3 sources on each topic in, I don't know, education. I'm making all this up, right? You know that. Okay, science, math, etc. Okay, what is another one?
I have a question. Where do the inputs go?
So like I said, right, it's all chaos. But in this situation, the activities are what I would call input. So basically, what you think about is, forget about the words. Just think A leads to B leads to C leads to D. So it really depends on how you frame your goals. Because if I'm designing this and I put my goal, my overall goal as, or maybe if I put my purpose, right, as access to books becomes a purpose, then your outputs become your activities. Get what I mean? And then this part becomes a very low level type of inputs. Like I need, 7 staff, right? And things like that. So don't worry about the science of it. Just get this logic like A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and then know that different donors would have different levels of analysis. Just like, some donors would be very evolved and say the purpose of this project, life, is to be happy, right? And some donors would say, well, the purpose of this project, i.e. life, is to make more money. So that would, then I consider that a low-level output, but that's something that they consider as a purpose. So you want to kind of map this according to what you think is going to be an end audience. Get it? So yeah, this one would be sort of like your input or your activities. So okay, does that help? Okay, so let's say, okay, access to books is 1, right? Increased scope of projects is number 2. Okay, what might be? Let's do another one.
Access to online resources.
Okay. Access to online resources. Okay, awesome. So if we wanted to achieve these outputs, what are some things we can do? Okay, first we have to build a library to house the books. That's still moot, right? Because somebody might say, well, do we really need a library? What about a peer-to-peer lending system? That's another possible activity. Forget about building the infrastructure of a library. We'll just do a peer-to-peer lending, or we'll do book donations to school, for example. But okay, let's say for our purposes we decide that we want to build a library, right? That's how we design projects, because another team would be doing something else, right? And then as a donor, what you would actually do is you would look at the project design and you would say, oh yeah, I kind of like these folks better, because I actually think that a library is way better than a peer-to-peer lending system. Okay, I'm going to award these folks, right? So that's how it is usually being evaluated in the real world. So okay, let's say build a library is a potential activity. What is another activity?
Increase number, quality of computers.
Okay, so increase quality. I'll put it in an activity. So if you put it in an active verb, how would you do it? Say.
But they also only have one school that actually has a computer lab, and it's too small.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
maybe build or expand a computer lab.
Okay, expand computer lab, good idea. Okay, 3. So usually, if you have about 3 outputs, you will have much more activities. So let's come with 5, just for discussion's sake. Good, expand computer lab. What other activities might we have? Access to online resources, maybe like, build local portal, I don't know, to local websites,
And
or
also build infrastructure to support online resources, like often and STD projects, the infrastructure is like the weak point.
okay. So, but I'm guessing that and this is what would happen in a big proposal, right? Okay, if this is like $1 million proposal, what you would probably do is say, okay, activity 1 is to build a library, and then you would go activity 1.1 is to, okay, buy bricks. No, I mean that's too low level. But you would say, okay, build infrastructure, right? 1.2, import books, right? 1.3, hire library staff. 1.4, yada yada yada. See, so if your proposal is incredibly big, like $1 million or more, you would have 1.1, 1.2, and then what you would do is you would plug these into your work plan. Does that make sense? I want you to just get the gist of it. Don't worry about the details. But in every activity, even if you're planning on graduation, this is a framework that you can use. So let's say, okay, expand computer labs, right? So you would go through the same thing again. How do you expand a computer lab? Hire a contractor, whatever you want to do. So, but let's not go into such detail. Let's give one more. Build a local portal, maybe. Okay, what might be another possible thing? Maybe, okay, enact policy change, enact educational policy change on educational resources, right? So basically, you are working with one of their recommendations, which is, hey, work with the Department of Education. So maybe what we could say is, well, geez, instead of providing these posters, can you please provide, at least 1 textbook per student or something like that as a policy change. So let's just say that that's a possible activity. Okay, then let's start with the simple indicators for each of these activities. Right? So what are some things? And how is an indicator different than any of these things on the left side?
Indicator means you're measuring the progress or success or failure of that activity.
Right.
To evaluating like one chunk of goal or outcome.
So, and that's great. And if you keep this in mind, this is important because these are actually the things that you will be evaluating and the things that will determine generally what is success or failure of that particular project. So let's look at activities first. Okay, so what are some indicators that you have been successful in activity 1? Right? So if you measure it, what would you look for? And it's kind of silly because you would say existence of a library, building, right? And sometimes you might have already identified it, within the school or whatever. What other things? A library.
Number of books in the library.
Okay, number of books. Maybe we should start with presence and number of books.
Also, a percentage increase in the number of topics that are now covered.
Okay, so types of books, right? And subject and topics. Okay, so let's look at just this part. And let's go to the other one. How do you verify it? Forget about the assumptions for now. The assumptions is yet another thing.
Site visits.
Okay, good. Site visits. What else? Database of books sorted by topic. Maybe, right? So, what else?
And you might have like a logbook that tells you how much is being spent at the library on staff to kind of verify that you actually have staff.
Okay, yep. Library, operational budget, and statements. Right, so that's awesome. So you get a sense about how you build your indicators. So, I'm sorry. So this one is actually.
Well, the budget could be a verifiable indicator, and the means of verification would be checking the statements. Possibly.
That's true, yeah. See, this is how we're talking about, like, this is dicing. You're dicing something really, really thin, and just to try to make sense of things. Okay, fine. Okay, how about expand computer lab? What is a verifier? I don't know, like square footage of lab?
I think we're also talking about the quality.
Okay, number of and square footage of labs, right? Because you could have 2 labs. Okay, satisfaction level of users.
The number of computers would be important.
Okay, number of computers. What else might be a possible?
Operational capacity of the computers would be.
Okay, downtime of connectivity and access, maybe, right? Okay, so that's probably enough for now. Sometimes log frames it depends on the donors. Like EU requires you to have, a really, really sophisticated log frames with a bunch of measurable indicators. And, some other donors don't. Okay, so then how would you gather these?
Site visits.
Photos, site visits, right? Testimonials, yes, I did, right? Customer surveys, customer satisfaction surveys, right? Inventory of equipment, inventory list of equipments because you're trying to measure the number of computers, right? And then log of downtime, logbook, or computer logs, for example. Okay, so are you guys getting the gist of how to measure and how to design? You know, there's too few of us in the very first place, and secondly, I think that, I don't know, maybe it's the Monday syndrome, you know, in the last semester, coupled with my ooziness. But do you get a sense of like how to use the log frame to design a framework, or to design a project? Right? And so there's the assumption side, right? Why would a donor why is this important to donors? And seriously, I mean, it is in that framework for a lot of the donors.
This gives a nice breakdown of the project as well as like means of assessment for the project, because that is what the donors are looking at. They don't want to kind of brainstorm later on how to, whether that investment was like a proper investment.
Right, yeah, and that's the breakdown of all these things, right? I mean, it helps you as a project manager to manage this too, to say, well, what are the first things, second things, third things. And so why are the assumptions important? Why is this column here for you to write down the assumptions?
Well, if we're proposing to build libraries, well, even before that, we're proposing to increase the number of books and increase access to books. We're clearly making an assumption about literacy.
Right.
The donor would want to know that there's actually literacy there, because if there's not, instead of getting more books, you need to increase literacy.
Right, absolutely. Because you're targeting the cause, right, of what you think is a problem statement. Your problem statement is, well, we think that we need more libraries to increase access to education. But might it be you need to increase literacy first? Awesome. So yeah, you can go down this list. And then what I would also mention is that donors will require you to put in means of indicators and verifications for these higher level things too. And the hard part for us as managers is that the higher up we go, the harder it gets to measure. So for example, right, I mean, how do you measure increased access to educational resources? Because in a lot of ways, or even your access to books, right? Pre and post number of books, you go through this stage. This part is still easy. But what are some of the indicators to say, increase access to educational resources? Aren't they the same indicators as these, right? So how would you build in something like that? It's hard, So maybe you can say, well, perception of teachers and perception of students that there is an increase in educational resources. Because the higher up you go, the more iffy it gets. And that's why measuring impact, right, is so much harder than measuring success of certain activities or certain project goals. So how about access to education and knowledge? I mean, how would you even measure this part? So when you go up here, you might go to, national